It's my very happy privilege to be able to open this conference, although I claim no standing in the field of American religious history. It is certainly an honor to be able to open this conference, which honors an esteemed colleague of mine, and I'll have a little more to say about that later in the course of affairs. But for right now, let me just say that I think the happy occasion of both having the chance to hear so many distinguished historians of American religion over a period of a day and a half comes very happily together with the chance to honor the career of David D. Hall. And I think not probably to this group, more does not need to be said at this point. We're all looking forward to this, and with no further ado, I want to turn it over to the three people, all former students here and students of David, who have really been the motors behind this conference and have really put everything together. Everything, of course, that goes wrong being our responsibility here, everything that goes right being thanks to their efforts. So let me ask Marie Griffith, Heather Curtis, and Mike McNally, please, to take it from here.
Thanks, Dean Graham, and I'd like to welcome you all here. This is a wonderful occasion. I can already feel good energy, and we're just here to say thank you to all of you for coming long distances and short, but most of you from long distances. And I'd like to thank Dean Graham and the Divinity School for supporting the event, and in particular to Janine McCullum, the events coordinator here, who's put things together. And as you can see from the stunning graphics on the program and the variety of events that we're participating in, this is high-class hosting that we are treated to. So thank you.
We just wanted to say a word about the idea of this conference, which began several years ago among David students. Many of you here who we've talked to, and you've talked to us about ideas for an event. And so we're grateful to you for that, too. We wanted an event, of course, that would be joyous as well as substantive, something that would celebrate David's formative role in all of our intellectual lives as well as our personal lives. And I think we've done a fine job bringing together people, all of whom were enthusiastic and wanted to be here. So we're very grateful to you all for that. When we approached the Divinity School, Dean Graham and everyone was just wonderful. So they've been all great to work with. So we're happy to have you here.
Many of you know, but some of you may not, that one of the ways that we would like to honor the career of David Hall is by the creation of a special endowment fund that will be used to support future graduate students here at Harvard Divinity School in American Religious History. I just wanted to remind you about that and hope that if you feel so moved to honor David's career in that way, that you can talk to any of the three of us over the course of the weekend. There's also some information out on the front tables along with the programs about different ways of making contributions. And if you have a contribution, I would actually be happy to take that over the course of the weekend. So with no further ado, I think we're going to open the conference. Thank you very much.
So good afternoon, everybody. I'm John O'Keefe from Wellesley College, a former student of David's. That you'll hear that phrase over and over again, I'm sure, over the course of the next 24 hours or so. What a great pleasure it is, really, to be part of this exciting conference honoring the scholarship and teaching of David Hall, which has been such an important formative part of the experiences of so many people in this room. And I'm very grateful to the organizers for giving me a chance to have a bit of a role in introducing some of the most creative and provocative work going forward in the field of religious history that is so very central not only to David's own wide-ranging work, but also, in my view, to the understandings that we can have in general of the North American past, as I'm sure we're going to hear as we listen to and talk about the papers that are about to be presented by three scholars very much on the cutting edge of American religious history today. Many people in this room probably have had their first experience with a new kind of religious history when David invited them into the mental world of Samuel Sewall. That was, as David explained it to us, a world of wonder as well as of learning. It's a world of conflict, a world shaped by the power of the written word, a world of practices that on examination brought together in surprising ways seemingly very contradictory beliefs, and a world of multivalency, which is actually a word I have not used since graduate school, so it's nice to have a chance to trot it out again. As David analyzed this world for his readers and his students, and this, of course, is only one, I pick an example almost at random of the work that I could talk about in this way, he really pushed the boundaries of our understanding of the religious sensibilities and the thought of the past far away from the boundaries that we glimpsed in earlier work by scholars such as Perry Miller and his immediate heirs. David's work rests on that rich body of work by the first scholars of the history of American civilization, to use a Harvard phrase. But his great gift to us, his students, has been to reimagine the focus of inquiry and the language that we can use to talk about the past. And today, thanks to David, the world of American religious history is a world of wonders and a world of learning at the same time. The papers that we're about to hear exemplify that in many ways. They push the boundaries of our understanding of the religious sensibilities of the past even further than David did in his early work. We're about to enter a world where we will glimpse new combinations of traditions and see the significance of context for religious experience that we have not yet considered. Each of the papers that we'll hear in its own way shows the significance of David's own work, even as they move to new frontiers of knowledge and interpretation and reflection. And I think we'll readily hear points of contact as well as points of departure in the next hour. So let's turn to this work. I think that I'm going to start by introducing our three speakers and our respondent all together now, and then each in turn will speak to us. And then I'll get back up because I'm sure there will be lots of questions, and I'll play a bit of a traffic cop as we close. And we may end a little bit after 5 o'clock, depending on how the conversation's going, but there'll be plenty of time for chatting and beverages also afterwards, right? That's okay? Okay. So first we'll hear from Doug Winarski, who's at the end. Doug is currently an associate professor in the Department of Religion at the University of Richmond in Virginia. Doug did his undergraduate work at Hamilton and then came here to the Div School to do an MTS. And he completed the PhD in Religious Studies at the University of Indiana in 2000. His dissertation was entitled All Manner of Error and Delusion, Josiah Cotton and the Religious Transformation of 18th Century Southeastern New England. And he has a book forthcoming from UNC Press, right? Still forthcoming? Yeah. Entitled Darkness Falls on the Land of Light, The Travail of New England Congregationalism. And he has as well a number of significant journal articles, which probably many of us have read. And as you might gather from the titles of Doug's work, his work has been a major reimagining of the 18th century religious landscape of New England, and we'll hear more about that in a moment. But his work already extends beyond that into the history of Native American religious practices, the history of the book, and other areas. Doug's work has been recognized with awards already from the American Folklore Society and the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture, among others. Second, we'll hear from Emma Anderson, currently an assistant professor of religion at the University of Ottawa. Emma did her undergraduate work at Carleton in Ottawa before coming to Harvard and doing an MTS at the Div School and then completing the PhD in religious studies here. Emma's first book, which came out just about a year ago, right, is called The Betrayal of Faith, The Tragic Journey of a Colonial Native Convert. And it examines the little-known life of Pierre-Antoine Pasteur-Deschamps. Close enough? Okay. An Aboriginal youth taken to France by Recollect missionaries. This excellent work has already been recognized by 2 awards. The best first book in the history of religion, which will be awarded next month at the AAR, and the Hegoy Prize from the French Colonial History Society. And I should mention I took the book out of the library at Wellesley to read it a while ago, and it had the great honor of being recalled by an undergraduate student for actual reading. So I think that's a good sign of the impact work can have. Emma's working on her second book now, and her presentation is a part of that work. And it's continuing to examine religious experiences of Native peoples, looking at the cult of Jean de Brebeuf, one of Canada's patron saints. We'll hear about that in a bit. And then third, we'll hear from Adrienne Weimer, currently a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the Humanities Research Center at Rice. Adrienne did her undergraduate work at Wake Forest and then went on to do an MA at Gordon Conwell and completed the PhD just last spring in the study of religion here at Harvard. Her dissertation is entitled Protestant Saints, Martyrdom and the Meaning of Sanctity in Early New England, and we'll hear more about the multiple meanings of sanctity in a moment. Adrienne's work has been recognized already with several significant fellowships, including an American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship and a Charles Warren Center Fellowship, in addition to the Mellon Fellowship she now holds. And as a respondent to these three young scholars, we're very fortunate to have with us one of the most distinguished figures in American religious history and a close friend of David's, Richard Bushman, currently the Howard W. Hunter Chair of Mormon Studies at Claremont Graduate University. Professor Bushman did his graduate work here at Harvard in the History of American Civilization program and went on to teaching positions and a long career at Brigham Young, Boston University, the University of Delaware, and Columbia before moving to Claremont just a year or so ago. His seminal written works are familiar to all of us, I'm sure, including among many, many others, from Puritan to Yankee, Character and Social Order in Connecticut, 1690 to 1765, Joseph Smith and the Beginnings of Mormonism, one of several works he's authored that have been instrumental in bringing Mormonism forward as a major field in American religious history, and The Refinement of America, Persons, Houses, Cities, itself a central work in the history of taste and culture. Professor Bushman's awards are literally too numerous to mention in great detail, but they include a Guggenheim Fellowship, National Humanities Center Fellowship, the Evans Biography Award, which he's won twice for his work on Joseph Smith, and the Bancroft Prize. So, without further ado, let's go to the papers, and let's start by welcoming Doug Winarski to the podium.
Well, thanks. It's a great honor to be here. My talk today is called The Great Newberry Prayer Bid Hoax. Worlds of Wonder, Days of Judgment begins with a memorable sketch of Samuel Sewall's mental world. It is, David explains, a messy and muddied world of negotiations, mediations, compromises, and tensions. But overall, he contends that New Englanders like Sewall at the turn of the 18th century participated in a shared religious culture. How do we move from Sewall's broadly tolerant congregationalism in provincial New England to the contentious, fragmented, and competitive religious marketplace of the early Republic? On the broadest level, this is the question that my book project seeks to resolve, and my overall thesis, to a large degree, trails in the wake of arguments that David has been advancing in a series of articles published over the past 15 years. Where in Worlds of Wonder he emphasized continuity over change and negotiation over tension, his more recent work on church affiliation strategies and Jonathan Edwards' 1749 dismissal from Northampton accent the growing strife that marked religious life in New England during the decades following Sewall's death in 1729. To be sure, Puritanism had always contained internal tensions, but David's recent essays seem to hint at a religious culture that was coming apart at the seams. What makes Edwards' writings of the 1740s so interesting, he recently suggested in a telling admission, was his ever-growing hostility to the socially inflected meanings of church membership. And that mounting frustration, moreover, was felt on all sides by ministers and lay people alike. Indeed, where 17th century ministers exhorted their parishioners to exercise a judgment of charity when assessing the spiritual practices and experiences of their neighbors, the middle decades of the 18th century witnessed a marked upsurge in charges of censoriousness across New England. I've argued elsewhere that the driving engine of this momentous shift was the emergence of a radical strain of early modern evangelicalism. In New England, uncompromising new lights who were committed to religious purity, Christian primitivism, and the charismatic gifts of the Holy Spirit eventually broke away from what had been, prior to 1740, a flourishing religious culture. What we've grown accustomed to calling the revivals of the Great Awakening were, in fact, a conscious attempt by radical evangelicals to repudiate the generally tolerant, irenic ethos of late 17th and early 18th century Puritanism. In my talk this afternoon, I'd like to present one intriguing example of this larger thesis, and I take as my point of departure this small manuscript, roughly the size of a 4x6 index card. The text is undated and unsigned, but judging from the handwriting, it appears to have been written sometime in the middle decades of the 18th century by a person of moderate literacy skills. And it reads, Christopher Tappan and wife desires to return thanks to God for his goodness to him in preserving of him when the devil cast a mist before him and his horse's eyes, throwing of him down, being in great danger. But God in his good providence, and his angels guarding him out of the hand of the devil. And after this I could not rest night or day thinking what the cause of it should be, till Friday morning it was revealed to me that it was because I opposed that great work of the devil. It seemed that the voice came to me and said, I need not trouble myself. It was that devil did it, that deceived all the people. And now I hope that God will enable me to oppose this great work of the devil and the instruments of it more than ever I did. There are two things to note about this document at the outset. The Christopher Tappan in question was the minister of the First Church of Newbury, Massachusetts, a 1691 graduate of Harvard College. He was ordained 5 years later and presided over the Newbury congregation for the next 5 decades until his death in 1747, which forms a terminal point for dating the manuscript. Toppin published little during his long career, and only a few manuscript sermons from his hand have survived. Instead, he was better known for his notoriously aggressive land speculation activities in Maine and his interest in the discovery of an alleged amphisbaena, about which he wrote to Cotton Mather and upon which John Greenleaf Whittier based his famous poem, The Double-Headed Snakes of Newbury. Second, and as you can see from this 1724 letter to Mather at the top here, there's a serious problem with the Toppin manuscript, which is at the bottom, which you can sort of see behind the panelists. For its handwriting is, without question, not that of the Newbury minister. Or to put the matter bluntly, this quirky manuscript is an 18th century hoax, a fictitious narrative penned in the name of an aging congregational minister. And thus it presents a kind of puzzle to be solved. Who wrote it? When? Why? And what does it tell us about the breakdown of New England's shared religious culture in the 18th century? Now, classifying the Toppin manuscript seems straightforward enough. It's an unusually detailed example of what 18th century Congregationalists would have called a prayer note or prayer bid. Provincial New Englanders frequently sent these small slips of paper bearing requests for prayers to their ministers, or tacked them to the meeting house door prior to worship exercises, or posted them in special boxes where they were collected and read during meeting. Prayer bids thus properly belong to what David has called the everyday thinking and doing of laymen and women. And like educational primers or financial receipts, moreover, prayer bids were so ubiquitous and so routine that in early New England that only a few examples have survived. To date, I've located a total of 182 known examples of this distinctive ritual practice, including 160 surviving manuscript prayer notes and 22 diary references to posting such documents. The largest group may be found among the papers of Northampton minister Jonathan Edwards and were published by Stephen Stein in an important William and Mary Quarterly article in 1980. Like Edwards, the North Haven, Connecticut minister Benjamin Trumbull scavenged his parishioners' prayer notes, using them as scrap paper for sermons and drafts of his early history of Connecticut. And so, too, did Cotton Mather and Yale President Ezra Stiles and a number of lesser-known ministers. Diarists, both prominent and obscure, occasionally noted posting prayer notes as well. The best-known prayer bid, for example, is the 1697 testimony in which Samuel Sewall repented of his involvement in the Salem witch trials. In total, prayer bids survive from more than a dozen New England parishes, as you can see here. Chronologically, they span the period from 1683, when Cotton Mather recorded the first known example in his diary, to 1814, the last dated manuscript among the Trumbull papers. And yet we need to recognize that the Toppin manuscript, with its fantastical account of Satan and spooked horses, is quite unlike any other known prayer bid. Indeed, as a genre, prayer notes tended to focus on very this-worldly issues, and they were remarkably resistant to change over time. Of the 182 known prayer bid requests submitted between 1683 and 1814, nearly half, or 49%, involved petitions begging God to heal and restore the bodies of sick and injured family members, servants, and neighbors. Edwards' Northampton parishioners, for example, submitted prayers on behalf of individuals burned in fires, nearly drowned in river accidents, or languishing under a wide variety of grievous wounds and dangerous diseases. A related category, which is illustrated here in the earliest known prayer bid manuscript, involved petitions of thanksgiving on behalf of women who had been successfully preserved during the dangers of childbirth and made the living mother of a living child. In fact, the practice of putting up notes was so closely associated with healing that one 18th century minister gauged the health of his community based on the number of prayer bids he received in a given month. In a few dire cases in which afflicted individuals were drawing near to their great change, as one Northampton man put it, petitioners sought divine assistance to be prepared and fitted to accept God's sovereign will. And hence the second largest category of prayer bids were requests like this one, signed by relatives of a deceased man named Abel Jacobs from North Haven, with its pleas for God to provide consolation in this afflicting stroke, patience under affliction, and warning for their own dissolution to meet with him in the world to come. The Jacobs prayer bid in particular falls within the well-known devotional pattern of preparationism described by one of David's most accomplished students, Charles Hambrick Stowe, in his landmark 1982 monograph, The Practice of Piety. At the same time, we need to recognize that notes asking God to sanctify the deaths of loved ones constitute only 23% of all known prayer requests. Far more numerous were petitions like that penned by Joel Clark of Northampton, who asked God to ease him of the pain he labors under and spare his life and restore his health. Thus, where scholars of Puritan spirituality have frequently suggested that laymen and women exhibited an almost single-minded preoccupation with knowing whether they were saved or damned, David's chapter on ritual in Worlds of Wonder and his more recent articles on baptism and family practices remind us that the religious can perform a very different kind of cultural work. With their emphases on physical healing, protection, safety, security, even material prosperity, prayer bids reveal the critical moments in which religious concerns were activated in the lives of 18th century laymen and women. And not surprisingly, as Robert Orsi has suggested in his own contribution to the Lived Religion volume, the timing of these periods of elevated religious concern coincided with temporal events involving sexual reproduction, human desire, bodily pain, and death. New England prayer bids, in other words, are more closely related to the world of local Catholic votive offerings described by William Christian in his work on 16th century Spain, or the vast repertoire of life course rituals available to 17th century Anglicans that David Cressy has cataloged, than to the Puritan morphology of conversion. But how specifically does the tradition of the prayer bid relate to the Toppin manuscript? Let's take a closer look at a few of the examples from the other category on the pie chart. Several of them address the one concern for which no layman or woman submitted a prayer bid prior to 1740, conversion. Despite their fascination with the practices of piety and the stages of grace, most devout New Englanders would have considered it perhaps inappropriate or quite possibly unlawful to beg God to carry them through the stages of conversion. Indeed, the only known public prayer that addresses conversion is a brief note penned by an anonymous member of Benjamin Trumbull's North Haven congregation during the summer of 1814. It reads, "Reverend Sir, your prayers and those of your church are humbly and earnestly requested in behalf of a young person who, having been brought under deep conviction for sin, has cast them off, grieved the Spirit of God, and returned back to the world." An exception that proves the rule of this prayer bid was so singular that Trumbull penned a special note on the reverse side acknowledging that a request for a prayer of this type was uncommon. 70 years earlier, during the Great Awakening in Boston, however, things had been very different, at least for a moment. Emboldened by the preaching of touring evangelist George Whitefield and Gilbert Tennant, scores of parishioners in Benjamin Coleman's Brattle Street Church began submitting prayer bids on behalf of family members and neighbors languishing in the throes of the new birth. By the time that Old South minister Thomas Prince wrote his account of the late revival of religion in Boston for his son's evangelical magazine, The Christian History, reports of bills put up in public for the awakened had suddenly emerged as visible markers of a wonderfully blessed revival season. During the spring and summer of 1742, moreover, the revivals in Boston entered a radical phase. Visiting itinerant preachers, including Andrew Croswell and James Davenport, shocked the town by branding several local ministers unconverted and encouraging zealous laymen and women to withdraw from communion in churches that failed to draw a sharp distinction between the elect and the mixed multitudes. Davenport, in particular, was roundly condemned by Charles Chauncey and his colleagues in the Boston Ministerial Association, who barred him from their pulpits. But he ignored their judgment and preached for nearly a week on Boston Common before he was jailed for disturbing the peace, tried, convicted, and deported from the colony. It was during these tumultuous weeks that one of Davenport's followers submitted a scandalous prayer bid to be read during a weeknight lecture meeting in the Brattle Street Church. Instead of asking for prayers on behalf of convicted sinners or beseeching God to pour out his Holy Spirit on New England, the petitioner requested that the congregation pray for the Boston Ministerial Association itself, which the document characterized as the choice cause of the present persecution of Christ in Boston or spiritual Jerusalem. Widely reported in the public prints, the spurious prayer bid directed against unconverted Old Light ministers provides a more immediate context for the Toppin manuscript. Unfortunately, time constraints allow me to provide only a brief sketch of the Great Awakening in Newbury, but suffice to say the town experienced one of New England's most powerful and divisive revival seasons. It's a familiar story in which George Whitefield, regional itinerant preachers, and lay exhorters successfully engineered a local revival that was punctuated by physically dramatic and socially disruptive conversions and visionary phenomena that tore at the fabric of the town's ecclesiastical hierarchies. Despite gathering scores of full church members in 1741 and 42, Toppin emerged from the controversies as one of the region's most outspoken Old Light opposers. In June 1743, a group of 28 aggrieved brethren withdrew from communion in the First Church. Over the next 4 years until his death in 1747, Toppin struggled and failed to discipline the disorderly walkers in his parish. Both groups called ex parte church councils in 1743 and 1744, in which partisan ministers endorsed their respective positions. 2 years later, the aggrieved brethren gathered an independent Presbyterian church in Newburyport and called one of New England's wildest New Light ministers, Jonathan Parsons of Lyme, Connecticut, to their pulpit. Tax lists from 1748 indicate that the rupture in Toppin's parish had resulted in the loss of nearly a third of his congregants. What most concerns us this afternoon is Toppin's reaction to the controversies that racked the final years of his ministry. He was, by all accounts, an obstinate, high-spirited man, and well known for being too severe and harsh in his expressions. In fact, local folklore suggests that he carried a whip to meeting during the revival years to scourge the radical enthusiasts among his congregants. During the ecclesiastical squabbles of the 1740s, moreover, Toppin seized upon an interpretation of the awakening that departed in significant ways from those offered by his colleagues. where Charles Chauncey and other outspoken revival opposers tended to naturalize the extravagant behavior of radical evangelicals, asserting that they had been misled by nerves, animal spirits, or overheated imaginations. Toppin reached for a supernatural explanation. On several occasions during the church councils of 1743 and 44, the aging Newbury minister attributed the insurgency within his parish to spiritual delusions and witchcraft instigated by Satan, and that the New Light men and schemers were possessed with an evil spirit. The forged prayer bid so closely mirrored the heated supernatural language that Toppin deployed during the Newbury church schism of the mid-1740s as to suggest that it was composed and circulated during these same contentious years. If my hypothesis is correct that the Toppin manuscript was penned by aggrieved members of the Newbury separatist faction around 1744, then what does the document tell us about the Great Awakening? During the revivals, and especially after their radical turn in 1742, old light critics frequently resorted to mocking the extravagant statements and behaviors of their opponents. The Toppin manuscript, however, is quite possibly the only known example of satire crafted by a group of New Light schemers. It was, in short, an attempt by Newbury's radical evangelical faction to fight fire with fire. The opening lines of the document clearly drew upon the conventions of traditional prayer bids. After all, the fictitious Toppin was asking for prayers of thanksgiving following a riding accident. But that was merely a pretense. The separatist wags who penned the document in the name of their aging minister were instead attempting to expose him as a superstitious enthusiast. The fictive Toppin claimed that he had decided to condemn the revivals, or what he calls that great work of the devil, in direct opposition to what proponents would have called the work of the Holy Spirit, following an encounter with Satan on the highways of town. His anti-revival stance, in other words, came not through reasoned argument, but from an imaginary voice inside his head. He comes across in this document as much an enthusiast deluded by impulses and impressions as his New Light antagonists in town. The circumstances that led to the creation of the Toppin manuscript were closely related to the cultural practices of what David has recently called scribal publication. To be more specific, the scurrilous prayer bit bears a kind of family resemblance to the anonymous doggerel verses exposing political or sexual misconduct that occasionally appeared tacked to the doors of major public buildings such as taverns or meeting houses. And like these libelous scribal manuscripts, its function appears to have been to criticize established authority through satire and mockery. No wonder Toppin's first move upon receiving news that the separatist parishioners had drawn up a series of articles against him was threatening to take them to civil court. We didn't push beyond the available evidence and hypothesize that the Toppin manuscript ranks among the earliest attempts by radical evangelical dissenters to enter into some kind of nascent public sphere in order to recognize a second and perhaps more significant aspect of the manuscript. As part of a ritual of misrule or inversion, the fraudulent Toppin prayer bid reveals quite a bit about radical New Light attitudes toward the practices of piety around which congregational life in New England had revolved for more than a century. To be sure, it lacks the elements of ritualized crowd violence that marked outbreaks of religious dissent in Europe or Pope's Day in New England itself, but in its own quiet, textualized way, the Newbury prayer bid hoax points to a broader theological breakdown in congregational culture after 1742. The willingness of the Newbury New Light schemers to satirize the practice of submitting prayer bids was, I believe, part of a broader campaign to subordinate religious duties and public ordinances to the inner experience of the new birth. Prior to 1740, ministers throughout New England had urged their parishioners to practice their Christ-commanded duties with diligence. But radical New Lights worked from a different logic, a logic of purity which suggested not only that true converts possessed infallible knowledge of their election, but that they should withdraw from communion and even social relations from those who could not testify to a similar experience. It was this logic, for example, that led James Davenport to separate his full church members into converted brothers and unconverted neighbors, restrict the privileges of baptism in the Lord's Supper to the former group, and re-sprinkle infants who had been baptized by purportedly unconverted ministers. His injunction to marry only converted saints was founded on similar grounds. The same logic of purity, moreover, stands behind the decision of Davenport's closest disciple, the future Newburyport separatist minister Jonathan Parsons, to forbid unconverted persons from joining in psalm singing during worship services. And only the logic of evangelical purity can account for East Haven minister Timothy Allen's notorious proclamation that the Bible was no better than an old almanac, at least when read through the eyes of the unregenerate. Without the concurring influence and operation of the Spirit of God, in other words, all outward, external religious practices and duties were hopelessly compromised, or worse, halfway houses on the road to hell for carnal, secure, and sleepy sinners who rested content in the performance of such duties. Posting prayer bids on behalf of sick family members, travelers, soldiers, or recently delivered mothers clearly fell within this category of radical New Light theology. As Grafton Solomon Prentice explained, the prayers of the unconverted were abominable in God's eyes. Even to pray in such a condition, he continued, was as fatal to the soul as rat's bane is to the body. Moderates, of course, denounce such unsound doctrines as being of a dangerous tendency, but they did provide a compelling logic through which radicals like the Newbury New Light faction justified their decision to separate from New England's standing order. Far from being a mere humorous incident in the Great Awakening, therefore, the Newbury prayer bid hoax points toward a broader crisis in New England congregational culture at mid-century. Of course, pious laymen and women had always recognized that devotional performances such as posting prayer bids for the sick and infirm were inadequate in God's eyes, but as we've seen, meriting salvation was rarely the point. Instead, many people believed that the prayer-hearing God might convey tangible, this-worldly benefits to his ardent petitioners. The willingness of the Newbury New Lights to irreverently satirize a practice that many consider to be one of the means of grace reinforced a broader insurgent theology of evangelical purity that took root in New England during the 1740s. And herein lay the dissolution of what David has rightly called the shared religious culture of early New England. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to attend this conference and present my work in honor of David here today. I should probably start with giving you the title of my presentation. It's called Blood, Fire, and Baptism, 3 Perspectives on the Death of Jean de Brébeuf, 17th Century Jesuit Martyr. On March 16th, 1649, the Jesuit mission of St. Louis, deep in Wendake, in the present-day Canadian province of Ontario, was overrun by Iroquois eager finally to gain ascendancy over their beleaguered Wendat rivals. Many people died that day, both during the battle and its aftermath, when the victorious Iroquois selectively punished their opponents through grueling torture before integrating the remaining survivors into their community. However, the death of Jesuit missionary Jean de Brébeuf has often been singled out for intense historical scrutiny and religious reflection. Just as his charred flesh and bones were contested by friends and foes alike, valued because of their religious power, variously understood as transformative food and as puissant relics, the story and meaning of his death has proven similarly contentious. This presentation will examine the death of Jean de Brébeuf from 3 angles: the blood, fire, and baptism of the title. Firstly, we will explore the perspective of Brébeuf, his Jesuit community, and his hagiographers, a viewpoint which interprets his torture and death at Aboriginal hands as a martyrdom, painting the missionary-native encounter in chiaroscuro tones, contrasting his luminous sanctity with the darkness of Aboriginal infidelity. Hagiographic descriptions of the death of Brébeuf, both images and texts, achieve the drama of their starkly illuminated central figure only by leaving other aspects of the scene, both literally and figuratively, in full shadow. The flames haloing Brébeuf's broken body, while revealing his pious suffering, bathe his antagonists in only a faint and devilish light. The better to illuminate these darkened figures, then, we must turn to the insights of ethnohistory. As we will explore, it's likely that the Iroquois who tormented Brébeuf perceived his destruction as significant only in its conformity to the regular practices of post-war torture rituals. For them, Brébeuf's death was in all likelihood less a Christian martyrdom than a complex ritual of punishment, testing, and sacrifice. In other words, business as usual. By exposing the profound and subtle psychological and religious roots of Aboriginal post-war torture and adoption customs, ethnohistorians have moved Aboriginal historical actors from inexplicable shadow to logical spotlight and decentered Brébeuf from the forefront of the historiographic stage by refocusing our attention on the broader intra-Aboriginal conflict in which his demise was a mere incident. Defensively mustered against one another, Both the hagiographic perspective and the viewpoint of ethno-historians eager to illuminate the internal logic of Iroquois post-war practices are incomplete. We must triangulate, considering also the little-studied viewpoint of Wendat apostates, those who had initially embraced and later rejected Christianity, whose perspective, contrasting sharply with both those of the Jesuits and traditionalist Iroquois, contextualizes, enriches, and reframes each. Captured during previous battles with the Iroquois, but targeted for integration into the community rather than fatal torture, these ex-Christian, ex-Wendats, employed against Brebeuf, their former catechist, innovative torments which highlighted the Christian identity of their victim while simultaneously repudiating their own past association with this foreign faith. Now, at first blush, this project seems a very strange fit indeed with the presentations of my colleagues, Adrian and Doug, despite the focus on the religious meanings of the pain-racked body that Adrian and I share. It may also seem a very odd choice for a conference intended to honor David Hall. Though he was an exact contemporary of John Cotton and died only a few years before the birth of one of David's own favorite subjects, Samuel Sewall, Jean de Brebeuf was certainly no Puritan, but a dyed-in-the-wool, post-Tridentine Jesuit priest who devoted his considerable physical stamina and spiritual vigor to the dream of constructing a Catholic North America. In short, he would have given poor Samuel Sewall the screaming heebie-jeebies, to use a technical term. However, though initially this presentation may seem a little anomalous, I think on closer examination we can see that digitus Davidus est. From this theoretical conception to its methodological execution, this study and the larger project it represents is informed and inspired by David's own work, particularly his groundbreaking re-examination of the Halfway Covenant. In choosing to look at this controversial event in New England church history, David faced a situation in which primary sources and the secondary historiography were complicit and seemed decisively to limit his interpretive possibilities. Declension! Thundered the Jeremiads. Declension indeed! Thundered Perry Miller and a Greek chorus of historians. What other possible way could there be to look at this decision to loosen rather than tighten requirements for admission into the Congregationalist Church? It seemed evident. As we know, however, David's carefully articulated alternative reading suggested that laymen and women sought inclusion in the church for their children not because of their spiritual laxity or indifference, but because of the inherent ambiguities of the covenant, and because of their very human paternal instincts to protect their offspring from threats both diabolical and natural. In listening to these lay people's voices, and in choosing not to dismiss their complex and often emotional arguments as evidence merely of their spiritual tepidity, David, along with Anne Brown, his co-writer, for the seminal chapter in Lived Religion, were able to open up fascinating new perspectives on this watershed event. It was their exploration of multiple perspectives that helped us better to understand this hard-fought campaign surrounding the Halfway Covenant in the way that the vague invocation of declension never could. Better understanding evolving family strategies restored to these defamed lay Puritans the dignity of their own perspective and the validity of their own priorities. But, and this is a key point, in challenging Puritan ministers' influential interpretation of the Halfway Covenant as a horrendous example of spiritual lassitude, David was not seeking to invalidate their perspective, merely to relativize it. In effect, he was seeking to topple the rubric of declension from its privileged position as the only viable and legitimate interpretation of the event. Once declension is decentered and understood as only one hypothesis advanced by historical actors to understand their contemporary events, rather than the interpretive lodestone of Puritanism, its peculiar power and historical situatedness can ironically perhaps be better appreciated. The similarities with my own project could not be more evident. Like David, I find myself, in studying the violent deaths of Brebeuf and other Jesuit missionaries in the 1640s, enmeshed in a historiography in which primary and secondary sources collude uncritically to present these deaths as martyrdoms, and often, consciously or unconsciously, denigrate the motivations and perspectives of historical actors, in this case, Aboriginal peoples, which they do not care to understand. Just as David rescued Puritan lay people from the specter of religious indifference, bitterly imputed to them by their ministerial leadership, I face the parallel task of rehabilitating Aboriginal historical actors tarred with centuries of equally unfair imputions of unthinking savagery and bloodthirstiness. We think of Francis Talbot's memorable phrase of the Iroquois, the ravenous rabble. Charming. But also, like David, my goal in taking up this challenge is not simply to overthrow the conventional interpretive rubric of martyrdom, for it, like the Puritan Jeremiads of declension, was decisive in the self-understanding of those who shaped it and in turn were shaped by it. Indeed, as argued by Brad Gregory in his influential comparative work on European martyrdom, we need to take seriously the religious basis of the would-be martyr's self-perception, as to fail to do so does violence, even more violence, to how these historical actors understood their own lives and deaths. Even as we acknowledge the importance of the concept of martyrdom in shaping the self-perception of Jesuit missionaries, however, we must resist its interpretive inevitability, its sort of interpretive gravitational pull on us as historians, turning instead to the equally legitimate, equally compelling religious perceptions of the other historical actors implicated in these deaths. These violent deaths were complex, multivalent events, perceived differently by the Jesuits, the Wendat communities, their missionization fatally fractured, and the largely traditionalist Iroquois, who sought politically and militarily to exploit these religious and political fissures. So without further ado, let's explore each of these perspectives in turn, starting with Blood, the Jesuit perspective. He stood before them, tied to a stake and struggling to hold on to consciousness. The haze of blood and sweat which coated his eyes would have made vision difficult, even had he not been exhausted from enduring grueling hours of torture. As his eyes struggled to focus, Brebeuf's mouth filled with blood from the wound where his tongue had been severed, flowing like a warm, salty drink down his throat and dribbling down his chin, making his beard into a bloodied mat. Deprived of speech or song in his final moments, and with which to encourage his fellow captives, the maimed missionary extended his mute gaze to the heaven he hoped would soon receive him. Jean de Brebeuf's perception of these final events of his life would have been colored by his long, trying years in the Canadian mission fields. In the 1640s, early Jesuit optimism regarding their ability to convert Aboriginal people was on the wane. Their uncompromisingly exclusivistic Catholic message was creating deepening cleavages within Wendat society, even as waves of epidemic hardened traditionalist opposition to their presence, and violent Iroquois incursions onto Wendat land increased in frequency and severity. Faced with these challenges, the Jesuits began to recast their mission in metaphors less redolent of Eden than of Golgotha, and to perceive and present themselves less as triumphant evangelists than as living martyrs, despised by those they came spiritually to rescue. It was in this context that Jean de Brebeuf began to anticipate and to embrace his future martyrdom. Writing his first self-dedication, which he signed in his own blood, stating that he was, quote, ready to sacrifice it all as willingly as I do this drop. Brebeuf in the 1640s escalated his already austere spiritual regimen, incorporating daily flagellation and the wearing of a hair shirt concealed under his robes. In 1644, whilst in prayer, he had a vision in which he perceived himself and his Jesuit compatriots sprinkled with drops of Christ's blood. Brebeuf's preparation for martyrdom was so single-minded that his Jesuit colleagues, concerned his body might be hidden or destroyed during the violent death he so avidly anticipated, persuaded him to donate while he yet lived a vial of his blood, that they might revere it as a relic in such an eventuality. The events of March 16th, 1649, then, were ones which Brebeuf had long anticipated and carefully prepared himself. He refused to flee St. Louis when it was apparent an Iroquois attack was imminent. During the approximately 4 hours of torture which he endured on that brutal March day, Brebeuf's behavior charged the events of his torment and death with a clear Christian message, but one which was also comprehensible in traditional Aboriginal terms. Until physically prevented from doing so by the removal of his tongue, Brebeuf hectored his tormentors to convert or repent, even as he encouraged his fellow Christian captives to hold to their faith, likely hoping to inspire Christian Wendats to win for themselves the laurels of martyrdom, while planting seeds of admiration in Iroquois hearts, which might in time ripen into receptivity to the Catholic message. Just as the Jesuits lovingly perceived Brebeuf's relics, unearthing, boiling, and carefully wrapping his bones in silk, even as they prepared to flee their mission stronghold in the face of renewed Iroquois assaults, they carefully guarded eyewitness accounts of his martyrdom. Recounted by devotional writers from Brebeuf's time to our own, this hagiographic presentation of his death received papal endorsement in 1925 with his beatification and 1930 with his canonization. That, then, is a glimpse into the Jesuit perspective. Now we must turn to the second perspective, fire, that of the Iroquois. The Iroquois' gaze traveled along the scene of devastation, regarding the large number of enemy women and children who, as captives, would be integrated into his community, and the spectacle of the ritual torture of enemy warriors unfolding before him. As his eyes traveled over the scenes of painful defiance, the warrior was keenly aware that, had the battle gone the other way, it was he who would be receiving these painful caresses. His roving attention was caught by the presence of an unusual captive, whose beard distinguished him as a European. Though repulsed by his bearded appearance, the Iroquois grudgingly approved of his courage in accepting his just punishment for having allied himself with the Wendat. Watching as the final blows were administered and the prisoner's heart removed, the man signaled his desire to imbibe a morsel of the man's flesh. The roots of the conflict between Atahansic's children, the Wendat, and the Iroquois ran deep into the pre-contact period. Tensions between these two Aboriginal polities, however, was greatly exacerbated by the European presence and the demographic, political, and economic changes it made to life on both sides of the St. Lawrence River, particularly the waves of devastating epidemic during the 1630s and 40s. Faced with a mounting demographic crisis, the Iroquois responded with an escalation of their traditional strategy of incorporative warfare, plundering the human resources of enemy neighbors to consolidate their own numbers. The Iroquois were masters of cultural integration, incorporating the vast majority of Wendat war captives through dramatic, complex, and often bloody rituals. Torturing and killing a few of the adult males as revenge for past Wendat slayings of their warriors, the Iroquois adopted the rest of the captives to serve as living containers for the reincarnated souls of their own beloved dead. These rituals of small-scale destruction, coupled with large-scale integration, we could sort of think of a blood transfusion, in fact, into the Iroquois body politic, were significant religious events which enacted meanings understood by both groups of Aboriginal antagonists. Ethnographic illumination of the complex logic of Aboriginal post-war practices, dubbed by Daniel Richter the Morning War Complex, stands in marked contrast to the hagiographic tendency simply to cast Aboriginal people as the deus ex machina of martyrdom, and reveals Brebeuf's torture and demise to be normative rather than unusual, and incidental rather than central. Iroquois ritual treatment of Brebeuf clearly reflects traditional Aboriginal post-war norms. It's nothing unusual. From this perspective, the characterization of Brebeuf's death as a martyrdom rests on a spurious distinction between his sufferings and the routine post-war agonies of countless Aboriginal people in early modern North America. If we define martyrdom as it has traditionally been defined, the fatal suffering inflicted on a Christian in odium fidei, in hatred of the faith, it is far from clear that Brebeuf's traditionalist Iroquois torturers had the anti-Christian motivation required by this definition. In other words, could they turn the dross of suffering into the gold of martyrdom? Did they hate Christianity? Other influential definitions of martyrdom, forged in the early Christian centuries, stress the martyr's volitional choice of painful death before religious infidelity, stressing that torture is being conditionally employed to force the martyr to recant his or her faith. But the logic of Aboriginal post-war practices was not built around such Christian assumptions. If Brebeuf, in the midst of his torture, had recanted his Christian faith, his torture would not have been halted, and Brebeuf knew this. Like an Aboriginal war prisoner, Brebeuf arguably embraced his limited agency by scripting his demise through the strenuous control of his own reactions. His defiance of his torturers, under the most extreme duress, met the expectations of both Iroquois and Wendat traditionalists. The eating of Brebeuf's heart, often presented by hagiographers as the apotheosis of Iroquois savagery, was in fact the highest compliment they could have paid to his courage. So now we're ready for the third perspective, just to make things interesting. Baptism. The man's large form, robbed of its ubiquitous black robe, was unfamiliar in its blood and nudity. Edging closer, the young Wendat wondered if this figure could be the Jesuit who had so engaged his youthful imagination with fascinating and disturbing images of hell and paradise. It had been a long time since the young man had seen his former catechist. Indeed, it seemed another lifetime. Captured in the ongoing low-level skirmishes characteristic of the smoldering Iroquois-Wendat conflict, this former convert had been selected for integration into the Iroquois community rather than singled out, as Brebeuf had done, for ritual sacrifice. So ingrained was his new Iroquois identity that the young man had today fought against his former Wendat community. The fallen missionary, however, presented a disturbing reminder of his former life and former faith. Reminding Brebeuf, using his own words to him, the necessity of baptism for salvation, the young man, grabbing a pot of boiling water from a nearby cooking fire, tipped it 3 times over Brebeuf's head and grimly told him, "Go to heaven, for you are well baptized." While the riches of Jesuit hagiography and advances in ethnohistory allow us to recreate with relative ease the Jesuit and Iroquois perspectives, the viewpoint of deconverted ex-Wendats, like those of most Aboriginal people who initially embraced and subsequently rejected Christianity, remains all but ignored by scholars. And indeed, it's hard to work with because there's not a lot of stuff in the sources about it. We do know, however, that Brebeuf's Wendat tormentors had been captured and integrated into the Iroquois community in the months or years prior to this fateful reunion with their former mentor. However, holes in our sources make it difficult for us to determine whether their deconversion took place prior to their capture, perhaps under the influence of Wendat traditionalists within their community, or represented a confirmation to Iroquois norms after the fact. What is clear, however, is that these former Christians modified traditional Aboriginal forms of torment the better to express their essentially different motivations for engaging in this ritual violence. Whereas the Iroquois appear to have apprehended Brebeuf politically in terms of being an ally with their enemies, militarily as being a retribution for Iroquois casualties, and religiously as a sacrifice, perhaps to the sun, this small group of deconverted ex-Wendats appear to have understood his torture torture which explicitly and derisively referenced the Christian sacrament of baptism, as publicly dramatizing their repudiation of Catholicism through ritual inversion. And again, the debt to David is clear. In confronting Brebeuf, these former converts effectively reversed their previous roles as recipients of baptism, appointing themselves the status of sacramental celebrants, administering it to Brebeuf. In ritually linking Brebeuf's baptism and his death, these Wendat ex-Christians were not only negating their own earlier baptisms, but rejecting the common association made by Wendat converts between baptism and physical health, by ritually signaling the imminent death of the black robe who had first introduced this practice and the deadly factionalism which had accompanied it into their communities. The unmistakable Christian inflection of the torments that these ex-Wendats, ex-Christians, inflicted on John de Brebeuf once again reopens the question of martyrdom from a different angle. As we have seen, the classic definition of Christian martyrdom requires that a martyr's suffering be occasioned by their antagonist's religious hatred of the faith. While these conditions seem to have been manifestly unmet by Iroquois traditionalists, perhaps we can't say the same thing for these Wendat apostates, whose creative modifications of traditional post-war torture, ritually inverting the sacrament of baptism, makes their participation in these actions markedly different from that of their Iroquois compatriots. Their torment of Brebeuf has something of the flavor of a secret conversation between the missionary and his former catechumens, one which utilized the shared yet disputed Christian ritual symbolism in the face, perhaps, of an uncomprehending Iroquois majority. Placed against the drama of two Aboriginal nations struggle to survive as coherent societies through debilitating epidemic, war, and the social, cultural, and religious changes which accompanied European contact, Brebeuf's celebrated death recedes from its accustomed place of hagiographic and historiographic centrality to become a mere vignette within a sweeping, compelling Aboriginal narrative of survival and change. Nor does the significance of the missionary's final hours within this wider Aboriginal context retain solely its conventional hagiographic characterization. While his death remains religiously meaningful, ethno-historical illumination of the underlying cultural and psychological purposes of Aboriginal post-war torture forces us to acknowledge that the Iroquoian concepts of ritual sacrifice, ingestion, and physical incorporation are at least as important to our understanding of Brebeuf's fate as is the more familiar Christian concept of martyrdom. One view, however, does not trump or extinguish the other two. Each perspective is necessary for our comprehension of the events. All, finally, in their way, are true. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie, Heather, Michael, Dean Graham. It really is an honor to be here and an honor to present alongside. It's difficult to pull us back out of all this fascinating Catholic and Aboriginal material, but we're back in 17th century Puritan New England for a few minutes. The title of my paper, Meat Out of the Eater, Practices of Sanctification in Puritan New England. A schoolteacher in Roxbury experienced the death of a stillborn son, followed by his wife's protracted illness following the birth. He responded by writing in his commonplace book, "I desire to acknowledge the hand of God in all, and quietly to submit to him. And I think that I never did once murmur against God for this stroke, but have cause to say that God has punished me far less than I deserve. Oh, that I could walk more humbly, circumspectly, and thankfully before God all my days." A few miles away, a young wife and mother who'd been in Massachusetts Bay Colony only a short time went through an extended sickness that caused her to have trouble breathing as well as making her partially lame. She called her illness a correction, which, in her words, "I saw the Lord sent to humble and try me and do me good, and it was not altogether ineffectual." She further explained this pattern in a letter to her children. "Among all my experiences of God's gracious dealings with me, I have constantly observed this, that he hath never suffered me long to sit loose from him, but by one affliction or other hath made me look home and search what was amiss. Throughout her life, as soon as she felt her heart was out of order, she began to expect divine correction. These corrections, she said, usually fell upon her body in the form of sickness, weakness, and pain. Occasionally, they took the form of spiritual doubts or fears about whether God was displeased with her or whether her faith was insincere. At other times, God struck her family. In her words, he hath smote a child with sickness, sometimes chastened me by losses in estate. This young woman claimed without qualification that all these times through God's great mercy have been the times of my greatest getting an advantage. Yea, I have found them the times when the Lord hath manifested the most love to me. The world of wonders inhabited by early New Englanders operated according to a strong form of providentialism, as David's work has masterfully opened up for us. A belief in the direct intervening hand of God in earthly affairs manifested itself in the interpretation of dramatic portents, such as blazing comets and the defeat of the Spanish Armada. God both delivered people from their enemies, in New England usually local heretics, and smote his people with fires and droughts for their collective sins. Providence also manifested itself in deeply individual ways. Episodes such as the ones I just mentioned have fueled a popular and sometimes scholarly, no one in this room, perception of the religion of early New England as sin-obsessed, harsh, passive towards human suffering, and perhaps even psychologically disturbed. What kind of parent could sustain the belief that God sent a child's sickness or even death as a correction for his sins? We've learned from David that the language of wonders was relevant in the lived religious worlds of the colonists because of a set of assumptions about the deeply intertwined nature of the social and moral orders. These assumptions are not obvious. They have had to be recovered. The language of personal affliction, which permeates the sermons, letters, and diaries of the 17th century, offers us a related challenge of uncovering assumptions about the affections and the body as intimately involved in the divine work of sanctification. Recovering these assumptions and their attendant spiritual practices is part of the larger project, launched in many ways by David, of moving our understanding of early American religion beyond the study of conversion or the threshold of church membership in order to attend to the rich, often messy, and sometimes unsettling landscape of Puritanism as a lived devotional movement. For Puritans, it was a truism that graces most often flourished in times of affliction and suffering. That's graces in the plural, referring not to God's grace, but to human graces, as in the special graces, this is from John Cotton, of faith, fear of God, hope, love, humility, patience, joy in God, etc. Akin to, but not identical with, the classical Christian virtues, fruits of the Spirit from Galatians, the armor of God from Ephesians, or the spiritual gifts in Corinthians, graces were sought out, this is the language of the text, sought out, received from God, enjoyed, exercised, and improved. The antinomian controversy debates about whether graces constituted evidence of true conversion has occluded the fact that graces were staples of the language and practice of sanctification throughout the 17th century. In John Cotton's words again, the graces of God's children, like the virtues of fruits, emerge when they are cut and poured out, or beaten, or burned, or bruised. Increase Mather agreed, God's children are like stars that shine brightest in the darkest night, like spices that smell sweetest when pounded. Their temporal losses are made up in spirituals. Michael Wigglesworth summarized in verse some of the more homely metaphors circulating at the time to describe the relationship between affliction and sanctification. Afflictions are God's refining pot, wherein he melts the gold, consumes the dross, and maketh it more lovely to behold. They are his fuller's soap, to wash our spots away, that being thus refined and washed, him glorify we may, as sharpest winter frosts do clarify the air, and cleanse our blood, soften the earth, and for its seed prepare, making it fruitfuler. So do afflictions sore correct the rankness of our hearts, cleanse and subdue them more. As I've written elsewhere, these assumptions about purity and pain stem both from the Bible and from a historical imagination filled with stories of martyrs from the early church and from the more recent persecutions of Protestants under the English Queen Bloody Mary in the 1550s. It's not fair to keep calling her that, Bloody Mary, but you know who I'm talking about. The more immediate context for the development of the practice of seeking graces through affliction, however, was the devotional revival, which swept across both Catholic and Protestant churches in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Intent on nurturing recusant communities in England, get a little bit of Catholicism, Jesuits such as Robert Parsons produced a rich collection of devotional manuals in the later 16th century. Alarmed by their own lack of a comparable literature and frustrated in their efforts at political reform, Protestant ministers such as William Perkins and Richard Rogers responded with manuals of their own in what is sometimes called the flowering of Puritan practical divinity. All of these manuals mapped out the interior landscape of the affections or emotions, as well as external forms of Christian practice, providing techniques of self-analysis, self-debate, and self-mastery. They instructed believers on how to transform their daily attitudes towards themselves, their bodies, their neighbors, and their environments. Devotion was linked everywhere to ascetic personal discipline. Directions for how to respond piously to affliction or hardship formed an important part of this devotional program. These directions were based on the assumption that afflictions are a crucial way God communicates with his children. Dexterity in reading the message of an affliction was a way of seeing the personal fatherly hand of God. The minister Thomas Case explained, "By affliction God maketh himself known unto his people. In the word we do but hear of God. In affliction we see him." Many times God's people come to know more of God or more experimentally by half a year's sufferings than by many years' sermons. Imagine a minister admitting that. In keeping with the impulse toward anti-formalism in Puritan culture, the directions for acquiring graces through afflictions were not systematic in their specific content or ordering of the steps. While each manual has variations, a few core elements appear both in the prescriptive manuals and in men's and women's accounts of their spiritual journeys through hardships. I call these elements the rituals of affliction in order to emphasize the ways they mediated between the natural and supernatural order, and you can see that here. One of the initial steps in these rituals of affliction was intense self-scrutiny, also called meditation on experience or an inquiry into the inward acts of our souls. And if you're familiar with Charles Hambrick Stowe's work, he's explored this in depth. Searching the heart for unconfessed sins such as Sabbath breaking or pride led to heart repentance and vows of reformation. Reading the runes of tribulation could help point to the kind and extent of sin at issue. For example, a mother suffering from a disrespectful daughter might need to look at her own behavior towards her mother. So you saw the connections in your life. Biblical figures also served as guides. After experiencing any kind of suffering, Anne Bradstreet wrote, "Then I have gone to searching and have said with David," that's the biblical David, not our David, though he and Anne Bradstreet know each other well, "Lord, search me and try me, and see what ways of wickedness are in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. And seldom or never, but I have found either some sin I lay under which God would have reformed, or some duty neglected which he would have performed. And by his help I have laid vows and bonds upon my soul to perform his righteous commands." In theory, a sickness or financial loss did not always mean that God was meting out judgment for an individual's sin. There were two kinds of affliction, the chastisement kind and the trial kind. Chastising afflictions, often drawing on the biblical story of David, implied judgment for sin. Afflictions sent to try the believer, on the other hand, often interpreted with reference to the biblical story of Job, implied God was testing your spiritual mettle in order to strengthen your graces for special service in the kingdom. In practice, New Englanders tended to interpret affliction in both ways, actually, simultaneously as a rebuke for sin and as a trial intended to fortify their graces. They could almost always find some sin to repent of, but they also maintained a sense that being singled out for affliction meant being specially chosen for spiritual growth and service. The second element of the rituals of affliction was declaring the theodicy, that God was right to send the hardship, whether it was directed towards a specific sin or not. It was vital to persuade oneself and then to affirm to others that, quote, "Our Heavenly Father knoweth what is best for us." They sometimes called this kissing the rod, and it meant acknowledging that God was a loving father who disciplined only for the utmost good of his children, to reclaim them from the world and bring them closer to himself. The devotional manuals provide a vast array of arguments for debating yourself into a sanctified frame of mind, one that could sincerely acknowledge God's goodness in the midst of suffering. Thirdly, godly responses to hardship involved regulating the affections. This technique meant first striving to control emotions like anger, fear, resentment, other dangerous passions, as they called them, and it was often shorthanded to murmuring. For example, when the tailor John Dane's house caught on fire in 1661, he first read the event in order to see God's hand and found several providences or providential messages. Then he noted his success in regulating his affections. "I do not know that I did murmur at it," he wrote, "but was silent, looking up to God to sanctify it to me." And I'll speak a little bit more about that word silent in the conclusion. The manuals guided the well-ordered heart not only to avoid murmuring, but to be willing to bear our crosses meekly and with cheerfulness. People were instructed to approach hardships willingly, even joyfully, knowing that spiritual growth was in store. Looking up to God to sanctify the affliction was the heart of the ritual. Through these and other practices, men and women could beseech God to sanctify their suffering, but it was God who ultimately bestowed the graces or made them shine. Overlapping with prayer and the effort to cultivate positive affections, experiencing the sanctifying work of God involved gaining a new ability to exercise and improve graces, such as patience and joy. When graces were bestowed, they were sometimes accompanied by supernatural experiences, abundance of sweetness and refreshment. Indeed, the people of God could expect to have this is a quote from a sermon, they could expect to have the most sensible experience of God's attributes in their suffering. Some devotional manuals acknowledge that few people mastered these practices of kissing the rod, even admitting that bearing afflictions rightly is the hardest part of our life. Ill for most of his adulthood and dissatisfied with his own ability to respond piously, the Malden pastor Michael Wigglesworth took special care to encourage the faint-hearted in his poetic devotional manual, Meat Out of the Eater. I'll give you the full title, Meat Out of the Eater, or Meditations Concerning the Necessity, End, and Usefulness of Afflictions unto God's Children, all tending to prepare them and comfort them under the cross. And this was widely read. It went through 4 editions before 1689. The title comes from the story of Samson's riddle in Judges 14. I had to look this up. The meat out of the eater. Is anyone familiar with meat out of the eater? I did not know this one. It refers to the honey of bees who, actually I didn't know it because it's in the midst of a lot of gruesome stuff in the Bible. It's not the kind of story that's taught in Sunday school. But it refers to the honey of bees who made their hive in the carcass of a lion. So it's a dead lion. And he's sort of rotting, and then bees go in and make their hive in the honey, and so the honey is the meat, and the eater is the lion. It remains to be seen if lay people indeed found spiritual honey or comfort under the cross through these devotional practices, as divines like Wigglesworth intended, or if they added an additional burden to the already weighty regime of Puritan piety. And this is Dwight Bozeman's argument, that they added an additional burden. It was a burdensome thing to practice these rituals of sanctification, and I think there's probably more work to be done. It also remains to further explore the many variations and forms of resistance in the practice of horseshed Christians as well as religious virtuosi. There are some hints in the sources that kissing the rod, that practicing these rituals of affliction could function as a kind of talisman. That is, lay people may have expected sure deliverance if they performed the rituals well, and further suffering if they failed to reach the standard. Puritan responses to pain were not passive, neither were their external responses to pain. The relationship between Christian graces such as patience or contentedness and activities such as fervently praying for healing, seeking out medical treatment, or vigorously working to ameliorate their physical and economic conditions is complicated, as the many conflicting responses to Max Weber have demonstrated. Though believers were, in this language of a sermon, to study duty more than deliverance, I have found no prescriptions in the manuals against trying to relieve suffering, only against dodging the suffering by unlawful means. Pious New Englanders performed the rituals of affliction not so much to dwell in their suffering or wallow in their sin, but in a well-known formulation of ritual to enact a reversal, transforming bodily sickness into spiritual health, or financial loss into spiritual gain, and perhaps emotional equilibrium as well. In a world with other kinds of wonders than antibiotics, these rituals may relieve an alternative kind of risk management, one that tried not primarily to eradicate suffering, as ours does, but to forge powerful new resources to wrest spiritual meat out of the eater of pain.
I know it's against the rules to laud David during the sessions, but when I was asked to comment, a story came to mind. David was commenting on a paper by Catherine Albanese at some conference or other, and all of his very first words as he stood up, or almost the first, were basically, Albanese's paper is wrong. Then, after this rather stunning opening, he went on to say, I noticed that Kathy's parents are in the audience, and I don't mean really wrong. But of course he did mean wrong, and it reminded me, this memory, of David's rather severe notion of truth. Anyone who has been on the receiving end of his criticisms knows both spiritual and bodily affliction. The thing is that untruths seem to cause him personal pain. And my comment today doesn't begin to come up to this very rigorous standard because I thoroughly enjoyed these papers. I learned a lot, and rather than dig up some untruth buried in them somewhere, I want to take off in a direction of my own. I come to this comment at an interesting moment in my life. For nearly a decade, I was preoccupied with Joseph Smith and all things Mormon as I finished up a biography on the Mormon prophet. This year, I began teaching at Claremont Graduate University, where I will offer courses both on Mormonism and American religion. And these new courses really require me to think freshly about the broad sweep of American religious history. Douglas Swinarski's paper happened to arrive in my email box first, and so I was caught up in his problematic. What changed in the 18th century? How did worlds of wonder and Sewell's broadly tolerant congregationalism transmute into the contentious, competitive religious marketplace of the early Republic? In keeping with the spirit of the conference, Douglas started from the hints he could pick up in David's recent writings about growing strife in New England and the heightening of censoriousness. Then Douglas proceeded to look at prayer bids, these notes for prayer posted on meeting house doors or put in boxes to be read, and especially this one fraudulent bid that exhibited a kind of mean-spirited ridicule of Christian Toppin of Newbury. And he interprets this as an indicator of growing censoriousness akin to the treatment of Edwards in Northampton. Well, Douglas's paper sparked in me the question of how I was going to talk about the trajectory of change going from the 17th to the 18th centuries. What was the 18th century world? How was it different from its predecessor? The paper got me to thinking about the tensions that this question sets up in our historiography. Talking about change has its dangers. You're tempted to do an injustice to both the before and the after in the interest of emphasizing transformation. From colony to province and from Puritan to Yankee are slightly at odds with the New England mind in the 17th century and Worlds of Wonder, Days of Judgment. The first set wants sharp distinction, the second, ambiguities and continuities. I'm particularly sensitive to this issue because of a conference David and I attended at Lehigh University a little over a decade ago. William Shade, political historian, invited us to talk about the 18th century. I was doing agriculture, and David talked about religion. It was the first time I heard him discourse on lived religion, a very revelatory moment. The gist of my talk was that the 19th century does an injustice to the 18th century. By that I mean the preoccupation with the great transformation accompanying the transition to capitalism can blind us to the dynamic vitality of 18th century agriculture. In order to establish a baseline for measuring the coming of market agriculture in the early decades of the 19th century, historians of that period make out the 18th century farmers as practicing a kind of sleepy subsistence agriculture. Most farmers produced for their households and skimmed off only a small surplus to send to market, while in the 19th century, production for exchange governed the organization of farm life. My paper argued against this simplification of agriculture, pointing to the intense commercial agriculture of the tobacco-growing regions of the South and the Middle Colonies' concentration on wheat for international markets, plus the necessity of feeding growing cities in the North and the spread of market farming around urban areas like Boston, Newport, and New London. At the end, I proposed a pair of geophysical models for describing change. One way to conceive of historical change is to liken it to traversing North America, going from east to west, from Mississippi to the Pacific. And the other is like going from north to south, from Canada to Mexico. The traveler going from east to west passes over the continental divide, at which point everything changes. Water that had flown to the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico at a certain point reverses direction and flows to the Columbia or the Colorado and thence to the Pacific. In the east-west model, it is important to note the point of inflection, where everything changes, the great transformation. Going from north to south, the change is equally marked from the cold plains of Canada to the hot deserts of Mexico, but there is no point of inflection. At no point can you say, here everything changes. You simply describe the landscape where you are and measure the change only at journey's end, looking down from above to characterize what had happened. All this came flooding back when I read Douglas's paper and wondered how it affected how I would teach American religious history, and especially how to deal with what David calls the age-old question of change. Was the before and after the big point about the 17th and 18th centuries, or was it more important to stop at the Platte River and survey the landscape, postponing an analysis of the Great Transition until the end of the journey? Of course, as historians, we can do both and do both. But I recognized that in doing religious history, I had been preoccupied with the Great Divide, the very model of change that I resisted when doing agricultural history. I have been from Puritan to Yankee type, who tended to sacrifice subtlety and accuracy to highlight change. The reflection started by reading these papers renewed my interest in how we identify change without slighting continuities. How do we talk about the past becoming the present without abusing the reality of a given moment? Douglas, in this paper, is a change person too. He uses his particular prayer bid like a wet finger raised to detect how the winds were blowing in the mid-18th century. The dead giveaway is his use of the word crisis in describing the Toppin incident. Crisis is a word used by those interested in change. Crisis comes as a build-up, like climbing up the steep slopes as we approach the Continental Divide. Because it implies a point of inflection, crisis language is part of the vocabulary of change historiography. Those more interested in continuities speak of tension rather than crisis, and the ongoing struggle of definition. In my reforming mode, I'm not taking Douglas to task for his interest in change. I think he's extraordinarily sensitive about not claiming too much for his little document. He identifies the coming of an admissible practice that indicates a broad shift in religious culture. We would simply have to ask in what ways this censoriousness was new. How did the fights over the ministers' salaries, for example, or the halfway covenant controversies differ from the Toppin incident? In short, we must always keep continuities in mind as we work on change. Adrian's paper is one that stops at the Platte to examine the rocks and the grass and the flow of the stream. She gives only a few sentences to positioning her analysis of the response to affliction within a framework of change. She speaks briefly of the devotional revival which swept across Protestant and Catholic churches in the late 16th and early 17th centuries and produced, as she said, a rich collection of devotional manuals, first among Catholics, then among English Protestants. William Perkins and Richard Rogers' much-used manuals of Puritan practical divinity instructed readers in a daily personal discipline designed to help one benefit spiritually from affliction, to welcome and enjoy it. In short, to kiss the rod that chastens you. The placement of these practices in a sweep of change is not her point. It is their morphology that interests her. She reconstructs the tactics devout souls use to derive spiritual gain from hard times, rather than tracing changes in such practices over time. Having delved into the experience of a number of devotees, she points to other fields to explore, but they are not ones that measure change. She is interested in the horseshed version and rod kissing as talisman, not what happened in the future to eliminate or modify these practices. Her agenda is to catalog and categorize the tactics for spiritual enhancement, not to note the coming and going. To locate these practices in the course of time would require a much longer perspective. One would probably have to move into the 19th century, when the understanding of illness and physical suffering as inescapable affliction began to recede. In the 17th century, affliction could be mitigated and partially remedied, but never escaped. 2 centuries later, this assumption gave way to a culture of health, where physical well-being was to be actively pursued. Indeed, by the middle of the 19th century, to fail to pursue health was a fault. One was expected to actively ward off illness and cultivate vigor and physical well-being. Making health the norm must have affected devotional exercises centered on affliction. All that Adrian talks about must have lost its strength and applicability when one was expected not to benefit from affliction, but to resist it. We can surely hypothesize a trajectory of change over 2 centuries. But is that the whole story? Undoubtedly not. Even in the 19th century, we can be sure there would be traces of the old practices still in place. Cultural practices don't fade, they only don't die, they only fade a little. 2 centuries after her examples, people were doubtlessly still seeking to turn bodily sickness into spiritual health, as she so aptly puts it. Too much concern about change on the part of people like me could hide these continuities. We're always tempted to exaggerate the disappearance of the old and the coming of the new. I don't know how to stuff Emma Anderson's recounting of Jean de Brebeuf's torturous death into my schema. It is such a compelling evocation of three perspectives on this notable event. I simply gave myself up to her storytelling. She makes a philosophical point I'm much in concurrence with about the necessity of embracing multiple views. But what does that have to do with change? Sorry, I've got a call from my wife. Yes, dear? Her imaginative narratives almost persuades me we can forget change. It is enough to relive a past moment in its drama and complexity. One additional perspective might possibly introduce the question of change into Emma's story. What do Indian historians today say about this incident? Would their take on the incident give us a measure of change? How do they look upon the tortured death of de Brebeuf in a time when Indians have given up torture and the white man's government has adopted it as an instrument of state? I've learned a lesson from these papers. They've helped me to realize that I need more of David's subtlety and responsiveness to ambiguity and less of my overly schematic preoccupation with transformation. None of us are going to give up on change over time, but I, for one, feel chastened and perhaps a little more dedicated to David's kind of truth. Thanks.
So we have a few minutes, I think, for some comments from others. Richard.
Emma, with respect to Brebeuf's own understanding of martyrdom before his death, does he ever comment, and if he doesn't, does any other Jesuit in Jesuit relations comment on the way in which Native Americans think of martyrdom, or rather torture? That is there already a discussion going on along the lines of your discussion in the sources themselves?
Perhaps not in the way that you're maybe suggesting in your question. There is the sort of underlying threat always with these Jesuit missionaries that they will end up living this fear. They certainly witness these post-war torture rituals. And in fact, in the self-dedication that Brebeuf makes, we talk about him writing it with his own blood. Mm-hmm. He specifically makes reference to these torture rituals and says, if it will be my fate to submit to this, I do so willingly. Thinking, of course, of the parallels with Adrian's work about the submission, the meanings of suffering. So there's not so much a sort of ethnographic analysis of the torture rituals and comparison. Sort of, maybe that's too much to expect.
Right,
but there is certainly this sort of preoccupation with this as perhaps being the ultimate sort of Via Dolorosa that they might have to walk in this New World context.
And just as a quick follow-up, the idea, as I understand Brebeuf, is that martyrdom would not be a test of his ability to maintain his faith. He would assume he could do that. It would rather be a gift. Mm-hmm. Is that...
Yeah, that sounds right to me. Because, in fact, what's interesting is that Brebeuf is not just, of course, alone in all this. How he would have been responding to his own future martyrdom would have been changed substantially by what had already happened to one of his fellow colleagues, Isaac Jogues, who was, in some ways, we can almost think of him as twice over martyred. He was captured by the Iroquois. He was tortured quite badly. He was a captive for some 18 months. Managed to escape, made it back to France, met Empress Anne and everyone else, and got a special papal dispensation to be able to say Mass with his disfigured fingers. Decides God is calling him to go back to the New World, does so, and the second time he is the missionary to the Iroquois. This time he's martyred decisively. This would have shaped Brebeuf's vision of what was going to happen to him, what he might have to endure. But the second part of your question, I forgot. What was it again?
Well, you've already answered it, I think. It's just, was he able to conceive of his own potential martyrdom as a test?
Oh,
I think
absolutely.
not. You think
no,
so?
No, as a gift, definitely.
Right.
Because there was another younger missionary who was martyred almost at the same time as Brebeuf. They were in the village together of St. Louis. The younger man, Gabriel Lallemant, had only come there about 10, maybe 12 days earlier. He'd replaced another missionary. And when this other missionary found out that Gabriel Lallemant and Jean de Brebeuf had met their deaths in this way, his first reaction was to envy them. Mm-hmm. And he says, I missed the crown just by that much. Mm-hmm. If only I'd been there, it would have been me. There's this real jealousy and envy in some ways that we get in these accounts, that the crown, the jewel, all these sorts of ways that they're talking about this ultimate gift are very much there. Yeah.
Somebody has a comment. Well, some of the continuities between the papers are really very striking, I think, just as Professor Bushman's comments have brought out, not only kind of in the grand scheme of the kind of historiographic traditions, but also these connections of the kind of visceral nature of the texts that you're working with, the languages of aesthetics and sensibility that really, I mean, just listening to the papers, those words pop out so profoundly. And, Catholic or Protestant, it's really quite remarkable. So. Well, we have plenty of time to continue a conversation. Down the hall in the Brown Room, I'm supposed to say exactly where it is, past the entrance, all the way to the end of the hall. Everybody is invited to join us for a reception. But first, let's pause and thank our presenters for the very rich and evocative work.